This section is the role of advertisers in the net zero transition. I guess as we approach net zero, it's going to be absolutely essential to look at all industries, not just the heavy polluting ones that have a significant influence on our overall footprint. And the advertising sector in particular plays a crucial role in shaping how consumers buy and do and all the things that they do with products and services. And this influence leads to what's termed as serviced emissions, the emissions resulting from increased consumption driven by advertising campaigns. Advertising said to be responsible for 32% of the annual carbon footprint of each and every single one of us in the UK, which seems like a lot. And in response, initiatives like the UN's Race to Zero campaign have introduced frameworks to guide companies, particularly service providers, including advertisers, to measure and reduce those emissions, get them down. So we've got a great panel of 3 distinguished guests that have joined us. Thank you. So we have on the end there, Nusa Urbanic with Changing Markets. We have Jonathan Wise with Purpose Disruptors, and we've got Stephen Woodford from the Advertising Association. So why don't we start by each and every one of you just introducing yourselves. Who are you? What do you do?
So I'm Stephen Woodford. I'm Chief Executive of the Advertising Association. I've had a long career in ad agencies, so I know the advertising sector pretty well. The Ad Association represents the whole of the ad industry, so all the key players, so the advertisers, the ad agencies, the commercial media owners, the big tech platforms, the production companies, the whole ecosystem are members of the Ad Association. And we work on, in effect, the big challenges the industry wants to see solved. And top of the list is, we have 3 things: sustainability, public trust, and inclusion. So we work on those programs on behalf of the industry to try and find industry-level solutions.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan.
Hi, folks. I'm Jonathan Wise, co-founder of Purpose Disruptors. Similar to Stephen, I've got experience working in advertising and working at creative agencies, mostly for big advertising group, WPP. And then after completing a master's in sustainability at Ashridge Business School, I founded, after going and living in a wood to find out what it was to be a man and all that sort of stuff, went and set up the thing called Purpose Disruptors, and it's 3 of us. And we've been running about 5 years now. It's a not-for-profit, and we have 3 programs. Change the Brief Alliance, which is connected to one of Stephen's projects, Ad Net Zero, which is a training program for people to work out how they can change the brief to promote more sustainable behaviours. The Good Life Project, so what would a good life be like in a more sustainable future? And Advertising Missions, which is what I lead, and I'll be talking about that as well. And I also tutor on the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership course on sustainable marketing, media and creative.
Great. Nusa?
Thank you. So hi, I'm Nusa. I'm the CEO of Changing Markets Foundation. We're mostly a campaigning organization, and we run campaign around different topics, from plastic pollution to fashion and its reliance on fossil fuels, and then also unsustainable food systems, and how do we shift from especially how do we reduce methane emissions, but then also how do we shift towards more plant-based products. And throughout our work, we kind of inadvertently became also a greenwashing observatory. So we've noticed that there's a lot of greenwashing across all the campaigns that we worked on. So we started this website called greenwash.com, where we wanted to kind of showcase how greenwashing looks in practice. And currently we cover fashion, plastic packaging, and food. So yeah, have a look, and maybe that's why I landed at this panel, although my knowledge in advertising industry is quite low. So
For an expert in greenwashing, wonderful.
Yeah.
We're going to get into a conversation, but if there are questions that you want to submit to the panel, then we do have a Slido going. So just open it up, find the ED Extra stage on there, and submit your questions and who you want to address those questions to. But I wonder then, Stephen, if we could start with you, and I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on this notion, this concept of serviced emissions, and how that pertains to the advertising industry.
So service emissions is a really simple concept, which is, in effect, it's the indirect emissions that arise from business advisory services. So if you think about accountants or management consultants or architects or advertising industry, there are lots and lots of businesses that advise other businesses. And if you look in the UK economy, UK particularly is a world leader in business services. So it's a big part of our economy. And those businesses can be anything from SMEs to huge multinational companies. But they tend not to have a huge footprint in their own right because they're offices and people and travel and so on. But the advice that they give can make a big difference. And I thought it was a great description that Race to Zero had in their report, which is that they're force multipliers, because their job is to advise businesses at a point of change.
Yeah.
Generally, consultants and so on come in when businesses are at points of inflection and change. And obviously, there's a huge amount of consulting work going on at the moment around sustainability. The thing I'd think, particularly about how it applies to advertising, because obviously you look at advertising businesses, it's by various estimates, about $1 trillion spent globally on advertising. So it's a huge business. And where I think it differs to other business services is it does have a big supply chain. So if you look at the digital ecosystem, which is largely funded by advertising, that is around about between 3 and 4% of global emissions, depending on the estimates you look at. So it's the same size as the aviation industry. And that's because digital media and all media pervades our lives. We have billions and billions of devices powered by advertising, ultimately. That's why all the apps and so on are free. And so advertising is at the core of, it's not the entirety of that ecosystem, but it's a key component of that ecosystem. So we do think it's very important to work on our supply chain as well as the influence that advertising has.
Yeah, interesting. So it's about the influence.
Yeah.
How do you calculate that, Jonathan? How do you calculate the influence advertising can have on footprints, carbon footprints?
Yeah, so I think that there's the direct emissions as which includes, like as you said, the business travel and things like offices and TV production, and then I think some of the digital supply chain as well. And then what I think for advertised emissions, we're looking at the reason why advertising ultimately exists, which is to help drive consumption on behalf of its clients. And so that's why I think the service emissions is interesting, because that's the link, because the influence that the industry has for its clients, at the base of the brief is how do we help drive consumption fundamentally for that particular brand or that particular client. And so the way that so advertised emissions is like service emissions for the advertising industry with its own methodology. And this idea preceded actually service emissions. So we were invited by the UNFCCC to present on on advertising emissions at COP26. And interestingly, the title of the presentation was Enabling Transparency in Advertising. So they saw this as an opportunity, as like a missing metric of revealing and showing and be transparent about that consumption-related kind of emissions. So we define advertised emissions as the greenhouse gas emissions that result from the uplift in sales generated by advertising. Again, kind of the business of advertising is to kind of help generate sales. And so whilst it's about transparency, I think personally for me and for Purpose Disruptors, this is sort of about freedom of choice, because I think what we're trying to do is allow the individuals in advertising and allow the organizations to kind of get a better understanding of the climate impact that they have. So you calculate advertised emissions by ad spend times by the return on investment of that advertising times by the carbon footprint of the thing that you're selling. So if you're selling, let's say, Land Rover Discoveries, and you've got a big spend, that's going to be a lot of advertising. If it's really effective, that's great. But if the carbon footprint of the things you're selling and is the incremental sales, that's going to have quite a big advertised emissions. Whereas if you were selling, I don't know, plant-based burgers rather than Big Macs, then your advertising emissions might come down if you're substituting those products. So it can go up or down. And I guess the idea here is that if we can present more information into the system, then individuals and agencies can then kind of go, is that something I want to be committing my time and resources to if it has a large advertised emission? So it's about freedom really rather than sustainability, because we think that's a more powerful kind of driver.
Yeah. And in terms of influence, Nusa, what's the best thing an advertising agency can do to influence consumer behavior in terms of, turning the needle on carbon footprints?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I mentioned before, we work on fashion where there's a lot of demand and there's a lot of very low quality clothes right now that are being sold. And we see some good example. For example, the Patagonia campaign, Don't Buy This Jacket, is an interesting example for me because they ran the ad in New York Times on Black Friday. But that campaign actually resulted in 30% increase in Patagonia's sales, right? And apparently every time they run this ads, the sales go up. And you could argue, okay, it's fine, Patagonia is a good company. Apparently their products are much more durable and better than the ones, I don't know, from Zara or whatever. But when we started looking at Patagonia, they never respond to any of the surveys that we send to them when we ask about transparency on the use of fossil fuels and what materials you're actually promoting. It's all kind of synthetic materials based from fossil fuels, maybe a little bit recycled polyester, which is actually breaking the loop from the plastic industry. So I have my doubts about them being a good company, and I have a little bit of a cynical view of their ads. They've also been really, they played a really, really key role in getting Sustainable Apparel Coalition and other kind of sector-specific initiatives to push recycled polyester as the solution to the sector's problems, right? So this is one example that I found that is always pushed as a fantastic example of the industry, but I don't really find it like that with the knowledge that I have of this sector. What we could potentially, like you mentioned, like plant-based foods versus like Big Macs and stuff like that, that I think could have really like substantial impact if the investment would go into these areas. We see quite a bit of trends going in the opposite direction. Our recent report showed that big meat and dairy companies are getting now really nervous about Gen Z and younger generations, like moving away from meat and dairy products, especially plant-based milks, I would say. So they're putting massive amounts of funding into trying to prevent that. They're working also with influencers, digital marketing. And yeah, I haven't really thought of which agencies work with them, but this would be really, really an interesting question and something to research, because this is kind of emissions comparable to fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, I think just two points, picking up on both things that you said. One on plant-based spreads, like dairy spread replacements. The spend on those went up very dramatically, I think 22, 23, tailed off a bit in 24. But that's partly because the category was established, so pretty much every brand, even Lurpak, like the ultimate butter, has a plant-based variant now. So I think we see often advertising, it makes markets, like help create the plant-based spreads market, as an example. And picking up on Jonathan's point about cars, something like 70% of the car market advertising is on EVs and hybrids, where in fact, it's 18% of the sales. So you can see there that the advertising, all those brands advertising are trying to shape where the market's going, and encourage, obviously, they've got huge sales targets to achieve because they've got fines if they don't achieve them. So there's massive investment going into driving those changes. In lots of markets, there aren't necessarily the big sustainable revolutionary products, but most big companies, even if they're just selling the same shampoo that they sold last year, they'll be looking to make the plastics more recyclable. They're looking at all their supply chain, their palm oil, all the other ingredients they use. There will be a huge amount of effort, even though it's not got a particularly sustainable proposition, to actually reduce the impacts of the supply chain. So one of the things that we see, because we're as Sonia mentioned, the Ad Net Zero program that we run, we deal with about 300 businesses around the world who have signed up for that. Everybody's on a journey, and advertisers are actually some of the most advanced in those journeys. So particularly when you see a broad range of businesses like that, actually it makes me feel optimistic, because there is a sense of urgency about this, and it is the detail that people work on. Because I'm sure everybody here in the room knows it's the detail of that supplier, not that supplier, or 2 people on a shoot versus 3 people on a shoot, or choosing a soundstage that runs on sustainable energy, which is some of the things that we do in advertising. So it's all about the detail, and you see a huge amount of effort going on that.
Jonathan, can you tell us a bit more about your advertised emissions framework you've developed, and how that works, and how that differs from sort of Scope 3 accounting?
Yeah, I think so. What we in just saying in terms of the equation. So the equation is the equation, and so we've got some people who've already done that. So Dentsu, who's one of the big 6 holding groups, they've already included advertiser emissions as part of their TCFD report, because they've sort of understood that this is going to come down the track. They believe that this is going to come down the track, either from Scope 3, it becoming mandatory within Scope 3, or CSRD reporting, etc. So there's they've already worked with Accenture to work on their advertiser emissions, and then another agency that's featured in our report, which is basically we're using the framework from the service emissions. So within the Race to Zero, they talk about there are 6 areas that you should be thinking about in order to transform your business as a service provider, whether you're McKinsey or WPP or Freshfields. Strategy and vision, governance and management, institutional capacity. 3rd, client project selection. 4, client relationships. 5, measurement. And 6, systemic changes. So we're using this framework, of which advertiser emissions is part of it. And in this, we're showing that people are already on the journey, as Stephen says. So we've got 2 global agencies, M&C Saatchi and Oliver, and they're already doing all these things, and they're starting to look at the methodology of advertiser emissions. And we've got we're funded in part by the UK government from the Knowledge Transfer Partnership, again to kind of increase the methodology rigor. So yeah, I think this is the way that we've been thinking about this. Is it's like, what is the economy going to be like, and what is our participation in helping make that happen? So in the UK, obviously, Keir Starmer has said that we're going to see a 81% reduction in emissions by 2035. And so at the moment, advertising and the whole economy is directed at sustaining, or largely, the existing levels of consumption. Right. So what is the levels of consumption going to be like, and what's the client mix in order to deliver that much lower carbon society? And the House of Lords have said that basically 32% of that massive reduction is going to come from consumer behavior change. So our invitation is like, if you have to work out your advertised emissions for your client mix, which are high, which are medium, which are high that may be unable to change, which are able to transition, red meat to plant-based, diesel and petrol to EVs, and which are where the growth industries. And advertiser emissions, I think, gives you a framework to consider your current portfolio and think strategically as a business, which of those brands are going to exist in the future, because they're not all going to succeed, and how do you skill up your teams to be able to service the new emergent businesses in the future. So, and that's going to be the same for your McKinsey, or you're the same for whoever. So I guess our kind of mantra is like, how can the industry do less harm in promoting high carbon consumption? And that will require some serious questions about who we advertise and who should we be focusing on skilling up, whether it's circular or whatever, to be able to allow the new economy to come forward and create, as architects of desire, that new economy. And so I think it's this really interesting tension about, do you want to help lead the society towards this economy, or do you want to be a laggard and stay where you are? And I think the framework allows that level of conversation.
And what's the role of investors? I mean, in that flow of money, in holding advertising companies to account when it comes to serviced emissions? What role do the investors play?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So one of the big 6 holding companies is called Publicis. And they've been in trouble on greenwashing, for example, around their work on Total and rebranding that as Total Energies. And so there was a letter that went to the CEO of Publicis and the board, asking them, what are you doing about hard to abate sectors like fossil fuels, because this is now a financial risk. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has said there should be a global ban on fossil fuels. So investors are saying, is this now a stranded business, stranded client, because you need to now report this? And so they were saying, in order for you then as Publicis to better manage the risk of your clients, you need to start reporting on your advertised emissions. And we're also seeing a request from that in the States. So advertised emissions is a way for businesses to manage the financial risks of the clients they're in. And ITV's done some interesting work on this as well, because if you've got exposure for clients that are no longer going to exist, or their businesses are going to be heavily impacted, like coffee and chocolate, if they're not going to advertise, the investors need to know about that, because your share price is going to be pretty screwed. So it's a risk management tool as much as it is a client selection, building a different economy tool.
Yeah. We had a question come in, which is an interesting one. Will companies rely more on influencers for their advertising strategy instead of the traditional agencies?
I mean,
to get around this point, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Like when we were doing research around meat and dairy companies and what they're trying to do to kind of tackle this perceived threat or real threat that young generations are eating more plant-based products, we've seen that, influencer work is really, really massive, and they're really kind of thinking about which influencers they want, how they speak to Gen Z. So they work with especially YouTube influencers, then different people that do podcasts. And then there's basically the White Lotus star that did Wood Milk ad. I don't know if you've seen that, but actually Audrey Plaza is her name. So she did an ad that plant-based milk is actually similar to wood milk. So therefore, it's not very nutritious. We've actually looked at all these narratives that they're using. And a lot of the narratives are actually kind of really seated in the advertising that we get from Big Meat and Dairy, which is around our products are natural, they're very good for you, they're very nutritious. And then the point of attack towards plant-based is like, they're actually ultra processed, so not very good for you. They don't have all these nutrients that you need. And then also on the environmental side, they're actually not that great because they come from monocultures. These are actually, this is not greenwashing, right? This is actually like a real targeted attack on the competition, and also really going after the population groups that are kind of on the front line of taking up this product. So that's kind of also something maybe to think about, when they're doing something that is actively undermining the transition. Like, how do you take that into account in your emissions calculations?
Stephen, what's your take on that?
Well, I think in the UK, we've got a regulator of advertising content called the Advertising Standards Authority that have very rigorous rules around the claims you can make. If you're making, most markets are competitive. You've got one set of businesses trying to compete against another set of businesses. So any claims that are made, whatever the media channel, whether it's an influencer on YouTube or a television ad on ITV, it has to comply with the rules. So you have to be factual. You can't overclaim. There's a huge, if anybody's interested, on the ASA website, you'll see all of the regulation around making sustainability claims. So it's probably, if not the most regulated part of the ad industry in terms of what you can say, certainly in the UK, it'd be one of the most.
Podcasts, is that included as well?
Podcasts will be included. It depends. If it's an editorial opinion in a podcast, it's any paid media. So if an influencer is being paid by a brand, they have to disclose it. Now, they're not always scrupulous about doing that, and the ASA actually catches a lot of influencers who either are not, who are saying things but they're not making it clear that they're being paid. You have to do hashtag ad. You've got to make it clear that you're being paid. Slightly muddied waters because some wannabe influencers pretend that they're being paid when they're not, because they were trying to build an audience. But if you look at that marketplace, actually, there's been we track trust in all media. There's been a big rise in trust because, in effect, the system has a self-governing factor, which is you only build an audience if you can be trusted. And the key to being trusted is if you are doing something on behalf of a brand, you've got to disclose it. The rules say you have to disclose it, and your own integrity as an influencer means if you don't, you'll lose your audience. So there's a sort of virtuous circle there. It is a fast-growing sector, but it's just one part of a very complex industry. Can I pick up on the advertised emissions point that Jonathan and the methodology and the companies that were mentioned? There are we're also working on the same check. We want to find a methodology that the whole industry can agree on this, and there's working groups that Jonathan is running. We've got a working group looking at it. We've been working with academics on it. At the moment, we haven't found that methodology, but we all want to get to a methodology that is workable to look at these emissions. When we did the consultation response to Race to Zero about about serviced emissions, one of the things that we found from lots of businesses who responded was they're very focused on what they have to comply with. Let's say to be science-based targets accredited, and if you like, the burden of doing those things is pretty high. And if you look at the upcoming European regulation, that the burden of that regulation is a whole different magnitude. So I think it's one of the challenges that all businesses face is that the resource that they can put, and they do put into sustainability, is constantly scaling up. So we want to find on advertised emissions, we want to find a methodology that the whole industry can agree with. Not to go into the differences, but Jonathan and I have had a debate in some of the media in our industry about the right methodology on this, but we're all aiming at the same end. We want the ad business, as all the businesses that it in effect represents, to be on a path to a sustainable position, certainly in the UK by 2050.
And it's a trend that we're going to hear time and time again over the next 2 days about the need for alignment and collaboration and hosts of working together. But
I'd love to, because again, being an optimist about this, an example that I was talking to Lauren about, who used to work for us on something called AdGreen. And AdGreen is a free tool for users to, in effect, measure and manage the carbon impact of ad production. So for the advertising supply chain, that's probably about 15-20% of the supply chain impact. And that was only achieved because we got the whole industry coming together to collaborate on a really good tool. We've been through a number of versions of it. We've just released the latest version of the software, and we're seeing really rapid take-up of that. And I think there's a really good example there of where industry-level collaboration, even the biggest firms, even the WPPs and the other really large firms, saw the value in a common industry approach to these challenges. And I think that's why ideally we get to a common industry agreement on advertised emissions, and share the work and all be in the same place on this, because we're all all aiming at the same endpoint.
Indeed. It's a subject we could probably talk for another hour on.
Have we run out of time?
We have run out of time. I know you'll be looking to get to your next keynote. So please show your appreciation for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.